September 1971. Phuoc Tuy Province, South Vietnam. An Australian SASR patrol moves through elephant grass so thick a man could hide 3 feet away. Trooper Neville Taylor, patrol machine gunner, carries something that makes American advisors do double takes when they see it. No tripod. No bipod. No carrying handle. Just a brutally shortened M60 with a pistol grip jury-rigged to the front and 200 rounds of belt-fed 7.62mm ammunition draped across his chest. 20 meters ahead, a Viet Cong squad crosses the trail. Taylor doesn't mount his weapon. Doesn't go prone. He fires from the hip, 23 pounds of machine gun bucking in his hands like a jackhammer. The sound is thunder. 50 rounds in 4 seconds. Smoke everywhere. By the time it clears, the enemy patrol has vanished into the jungle. Dead or scattered, the SASR never knew. They didn't stick around to find out. That was the job. Hit hard. Disappear. The weapon that made it possible? Officially, it was just an M60. Unofficially, it was something else entirely. In 1966, Australia committed its first major combat force to Vietnam, the first Australian task force, established at Nui that base in Phuoc Tuy Province. Among that force was 3 Squadron, Special Air Service Regiment, an elite unit modelled on Britain's legendary SAS but forged in Australia's own tradition of long-range patrol and unconventional warfare. By the time the last SASR squadron rotated home in 1971, 3 squadrons had completed 2 tours each, conducting reconnaissance and direct action missions in some of the war's most dangerous terrain. Their mission was unique. While conventional infantry battalions operated in company-strength sweeps, hundreds of men with artillery and air support, the SASR operated in 4 to 6-man patrols. Deep penetration reconnaissance. Ambushes. Intelligence gathering. They'd slip into enemy base areas for 7, 10, sometimes 14 days at a stretch, moving silently through jungle so thick that visibility dropped to arm's length, living on survival rations and whatever water they could carry. One mistake, one compromised position, meant being surrounded by Viet Cong who knew that terrain like their own backyard. The enemy in Phuoc Tuy Province wasn't a ragtag guerrilla force. D445 Battalion, the main Viet Cong unit operating in the province, was well-trained, well-equipped, and intimately familiar with every trail, every water source, every hiding spot in those jungles. They'd been fighting on that ground for years, first against the French, now against the Americans and their allies. They didn't fear conventional forces. Large formations made noise. They could be detected, avoided, or led into prepared ambushes. But the SASR was different. The Viet Cong called them Ma Rung, the phantoms of the jungle. They'd learned that when Australians were in the area, traditional ambush tactics failed. SASR patrols were too small to detect easily, too well trained to make noise, and when they did make contact, the violence was sudden, overwhelming, and over before reinforcements could arrive. By the war's end, Australian SAS would achieve a kill ratio estimated at 100 to 1, approximately 500 enemy killed for only 5 SASR soldiers lost to enemy action. It remains one of the highest combat effectiveness ratings of any unit in the Vietnam War. The Australian SAS faced a weapons problem that conventional forces didn't have to solve. Standard infantry could carry the M60 as designed, 23.15 pounds with a 22-inch barrel, integral bipod, and carrying handle. A dedicated gunner carried the weapon. His assistant gunner carried the tripod and spare barrels. The rest of the squad carried ammunition. Total crew, 3 men, minimum. That worked fine when you had platoon strength or company strength. But a 4-man SASR patrol couldn't afford to dedicate 3 positions to a single weapon system. Every man had to carry his own weapon, his own ammunition, rations for 2 weeks, water, radio batteries, grenades, claymore mines, and medical supplies. Pack weights routinely exceeded 80 pounds. There was no room for non-combatants. There were no spare hands. The M60 as issued was simply too heavy for its role. At 43.5 inches overall length, It was unwieldy in thick jungle where branches grabbed everything. The bipod added weight and bulk. The carrying handle, while useful for crew-served operations, was unnecessary dead weight for special operations. Worse, the weapon was designed for sustained fire from fixed positions, exactly the opposite of how SASR operated. They needed instant, overwhelming firepower for 15-second engagements, then immediate withdrawal. Speed mattered more than sustained fire capability. American weapons didn't fit the bill either. The M16 was light and handy, but firing 5.56mm ammunition, it lacked stopping power at anything beyond close range. The Viet Cong learned quickly that they could absorb M16 fire and keep fighting, especially through jungle foliage. The Thompson submachine gun and its successor, the M3 grease gun, were reliable but limited to pistol calibers, fine for close quarters, inadequate for anything beyond 50 meters. The Stoner 63 system, highly regarded by some American special operations units, was rare and unfamiliar to Australian armour. The L1A1 self-loading rifle, the Australian Army's standard battle rifle firing 7.62mm NATO, was excellent for accuracy and stopping power. SASR soldiers loved it. But it was semi-automatic only in its standard configuration, and it lacked the sustained fire capability needed to break contact when a patrol stumbled into numerically superior forces. A four-man team discovering a 40-man Viet Cong unit needed instant, overwhelming violence to create shock and by seconds for escape. That required a machine gun. But it had to be a machine gun that one man could carry and fire without setup time. The M60, as issued, wasn't that weapon. So the Australians decided to make it that weapon. The field modification of the M60 didn't come from official channels. There was no engineer's name attached, no formal proposal to Army headquarters in Canberra, no technical data package. It came from armourers and soldiers in Vietnam who saw a problem and fixed it with a hacksaw and common sense. That was the Australian way, pragmatic, direct, and utterly unconcerned with what the manual said. The exact origin is lost to the informal nature of field modifications, but by 1967, modified M60s were appearing with increasing frequency among SASR patrols. Armourers at Nui that base, skilled tradesmen who kept the task force's weapons running in mud, humidity, and constant use, began experimenting. The modifications were surprisingly simple. First, they removed the bipod assembly. Full bolts. Gone. Immediate weight savings. Then they cut the barrel. Standard M60 barrel length was 22 inches from the gas block to the muzzle. The modified version cut that down to approximately 18 inches, sometimes less. Some versions retained the flash suppressor. Others dispensed with it entirely, accepting the muzzle flash as a trade-off for reduced weight and length. The most distinctive modification was the forward pistol grip. Without the bipod, the shortened M60 needed a way to control muzzle climb during automatic fire. The solution was elegantly simple. Take a pistol grip from a damaged or surplus L1A1 self-loading rifle and attach it to the M60's forearm assembly. Some armourers fabricated custom metal brackets. Others used heavy-duty tape and wire, trusting friction and ingenuity over engineering precision. The result looked crude. It was crude. But it worked. Not every M60 in SASR service was modified. Conventional wisdom says perhaps one per squadron received the treatment, issued to specific patrols conducting direct action missions where the weight savings and close quarters firepower justified the loss of sustained fire capability. The weapon earned nicknames. Some called it the bitch, borrowing from the nickname Australian soldiers had given their illegally modified, full-auto L1A1 rifles. Others simply called it the Commando M60 or the Cut-Down 60. The name mattered less than what it did. Technical breakdown. Start with the base weapon. The M60 machine gun, officially designated machine gun, caliber 7.62mm, M60, entered United States service in 1957. Manufactured by Sacco Defense Industries and later by other contractors, it was designed as a general-purpose machine gun, a single weapon that could serve as a light machine gun for infantry squads or a medium machine gun on vehicles and fixed emplacements. It fired the 7.62 by 51 mm NATO cartridge from a disintegrating link belt, gas-operated with a rotating bolt. Rate of fire: 550 to 650 rounds per minute. Muzzle velocity: 2,800 feet per second. Maximum effective range on the bipod: 1,100 meters. Weight as issued: 23.15 pounds unloaded. Now apply the modifications. Remove the bipod assembly, which weighed approximately 2.5 pounds. Cut the barrel down from 22 inches to roughly 18 inches, saving another pound of steel. Remove the carrying handle and simplify the barrel jacket. Total weight savings: approximately 4 to 5 pounds. The modified M60 came down to around 18 to 19 pounds, still heavy, but manageable for one man over extended patrol operations. The shortened barrel had consequences. Reducing barrel length from 22 to 18 inches dropped muzzle velocity by approximately 100 to 150 feet per second, not insignificant, but acceptable for engagements inside 300 meters, where most jungle contacts occurred. The real trade-off was barrel life. Standard M60 barrels were designed for sustained fire with regular barrel changes. Shortened barrels heated faster and wore out sooner. But SASR patrols weren't laying down sustained suppressive fire. They were firing 50 to 100 rounds and then breaking contact. Barrel wear was a logistics problem, not a tactical one. The forward pistol grip was the modification that made hip firing practical. Standard infantry doctrine called for firing the M60 from the shoulder when using the bipod, or from the hip only in emergencies with minimal accuracy. The modified version inverted that doctrine. With the pistol grip mounted approximately 12 inches forward of the trigger group, a soldier could brace the weapon against his hip, control the front end with his offhand on the grip, and pour fire into an ambush zone while moving. Accuracy suffered compared to aimed fire from a mounted position, but in jungle engagements where visibility was 10 to 30 meters, accuracy mattered less than volume and speed. Ammunition was carried in different configurations depending on the patrol. Some machine gunners wore 100-round belts across the chest, bandolier style, visually dramatic but awkward when going prone. Others carried ammunition in modified canvas pouches or simply stuffed loose belts into their packs, pulling it out as needed. The modified M60 retained the standard M60 feed system, so any linked 7.62 mm NATO ammunition worked without modification. One crucial advantage: the gas system remained unchanged. The M60's gas-operated action was relatively simple and robust. By leaving the gas block and piston assembly intact, the modification retained the weapon's reliability. This wasn't a precision gunsmithing job. It was a field-expedient solution that worked because it didn't try to reinvent the weapon's fundamental operating system. The result was a weapon that looked like someone had attacked an M60 with a hacksaw, because someone had. It wasn't pretty. It wasn't regulation. But for a four-man SASR patrol deep in Viet Cong territory, it was exactly what they needed. Now, if you're finding this interesting, consider subscribing. We are building something here for people who actually care about the details, the modifications that never made it into official histories, the field-expedient solutions that shaped how wars were actually fought. It takes a second, costs nothing, and helps the channel grow. Let's keep digging into these stories. The modified M60 entered combat alongside standard SASR weapons, L1A1 rifles, Owen submachine guns, M16S, and later the F1 submachine gun. Its first documented use is difficult to pin down precisely, owing to the informal nature of the modification and the classified nature of SASR operations at the time. But by 1968, photographic evidence and after-action reports confirm that cut-down M60s were in regular use. The weapon's role was specific, immediate, overwhelming firepower during chance contacts and ambushes. SASR doctrine emphasized stealth and reconnaissance. Most patrols completed their missions without firing a shot. But when contact occurred, when a patrol stumbled onto a Viet Cong base camp, or when the enemy detected them first, those first 5 seconds determined whether the patrol survived. The modified M60 gave them a fighting chance. Consider a typical scenario. A 4-man SASR patrol is moving through dense jungle, single file, 5-meter spacing. The point man rounds a bend and walks into a Viet Cong squad moving the opposite direction. Both sides freeze for half a second. Then chaos. The machine gunner doesn't have time to go prone, set up a bipod, and acquire targets. He needs to fire now. With the modified M60, he can. Weapon at the hip, grip forward. He pours 50 rounds into the contact area in 4 seconds. The sound alone is disorienting. A belt-fed machine gun at full automatic in confined jungle sounds like artillery. The enemy scatters. The patrol throws smoke and disappears in the opposite direction. Mission: break contact and survive. The modified M60 made that possible. Trooper accounts, filtered through Australian war memoirs and veteran interviews years later, emphasized the weapon's psychological impact. Quote from a 2nd Squadron veteran interviewed in the 1990s. "The 60 was our insurance policy. You hoped you'd never need it, but when you did, nothing else would do the job. Bloke with the cutdown could put more rounds downrange in 5 seconds than the whole rest of the patrol combined." Another SASR soldier, speaking anonymously to a military historian, "It wasn't about accuracy. It was about noise and shock. Charlie didn't know if he'd run into 4 of us or 40. That's what kept us alive." The modified weapon wasn't without drawbacks. Muzzle blast from the shortened barrel was ferocious, intense enough to cause temporary hearing damage without ear protection, which SASR patrols couldn't wear because they needed to hear enemy movement. Muzzle flash at night was significant, marking the shooter's position clearly. And hip firing a 23-pound machine gun, even a lightened one, required upper body strength and practice. Not every soldier could control it effectively. But for those who could, it was devastating. The modified M60 saw action throughout SASR's Vietnam deployment, from operations in the Long High Hills to the Mae Dao Mountains, from cordon and search missions to long-range reconnaissance patrols deep into border areas where Viet Cong supply routes ran. It never became the primary weapon of SASR patrols, but it earned respect as a specialized tool for specific situations where nothing else provided the same combination of portability and firepower. The modified M60 didn't change the course of the Vietnam War. It didn't revolutionize infantry tactics. What it did was give Australian SAS soldiers one more tool that increased their survivability and effectiveness in an environment where both were measured in razor-thin margins. The psychological impact on the Viet Cong shouldn't be underestimated. Small unit ambushes relied on surprise and numerical superiority. A standard infantry patrol, surprised by a larger enemy force, would typically return fire with rifles and attempt to establish a defensive perimeter while calling for support. That took time for the enemy to maneuver, time for reinforcements to arrive. SASR patrols didn't wait for support. They generated instant, overwhelming firepower, created confusion, and vanished. The modified M60 was central to that capability. From a doctrinal perspective, the weapon represented the Australian SAS's willingness to adapt equipment to mission requirements rather than adapting missions to available equipment. This philosophy was consistent throughout SASR operations in Vietnam. When the L1A1 rifle's semi-automatic-only configuration proved limiting, armorers modified select weapons to fire full automatic. When standard loadouts proved too heavy, soldiers discarded non-essential gear and carried what worked. The modified M60 was part of that same pragmatic tradition. The weapon's influence on other units is harder to quantify. American MACVSOG, Military Assistance Command, Vietnam, Studies and Observations Group, units also modified M60s, cutting down barrels and removing bipods for similar reasons. Whether they learned from the Australians, developed the modifications independently, or shared techniques through cross-training is unclear. What's certain is that by 1969, modified M60s appeared in multiple special operations units across Vietnam, suggesting that the concept, lightweight, belt-fed firepower for small patrols, filled a recognized capability gap. Production and service life. The modified M60 was never a production weapon. There was no assembly line, no serial numbers, no official designation. Each modified weapon was a one-off, created by armorers at Nui that or by soldiers in the field. Estimates suggest perhaps a dozen to 20 modified M60s existed at any given time during SASR's Vietnam deployment from 1966 to 1971. That's speculation. No official records tracked these modifications because officially, they didn't exist. When SASR squadrons rotated home, modified weapons likely remained in Vietnam, issued to incoming squadrons or quietly returned to standard configuration. Some may have been destroyed or left behind during the Australian withdrawal in 1971. Unlike official weapon systems, which are carefully inventoried and accounted for, field modifications have a way of vanishing when the units that created them move on. Post-Vietnam, the concept of cutting down machine guns for special operations use continued. Modern iterations like the 43 Malawian Quachas Mod 0 and M60E4 incorporated lessons from Vietnam: shortened barrels, reduced weight, forward grips. These later variants were officially sanctioned, engineered properly, and issued through normal channels. But the SASR's cut-down M60 in Vietnam was pure field expedient, soldiers solving problems with the tools at hand. Today, surviving examples of SASR-modified M60s from Vietnam are extremely rare, possibly non-existent. Museums hold standard-issue M60s, collectors own demilitarized versions. But the cut-down, forward-grip variants? They live primarily in photographs, veteran accounts, and the occasional artifact that might surface in private collections. Their scarcity makes sense. They were never meant to last. They were meant to work. The modified SASR M60 represents a broader tradition in Australian military history, soldiers adapting, innovating, and making do with what's available. From the Owen gun in World War II to the cut-down L1A1 rifles in Vietnam, Australian soldiers have consistently modified weapons when official issue didn't meet operational needs. The modified M60 fits squarely in that lineage. Its influence on modern weapons development is indirect but real. The proliferation of shortened, lightened machine gun variants in the 1980s and 1990s, weapons like the M60E3, the 48 Malawian Quachas, and eventually the M60E6, reflected lessons learned in Vietnam. Special operations forces needed belt-fed firepower without the weight penalty of full-size general-purpose machine guns. Engineers eventually caught up to what soldiers had been doing in the field for years. The weapon also stands as a reminder that military innovation doesn't always flow from the top down. Sometimes the best solutions come from the ground up, from armorers and soldiers who see problems firsthand and fix them without waiting for official approval. That approach has risks. Field modifications bypass safety testing, quality control, and standardized training. But in combat, where the alternative might be carrying inadequate weapons, soldiers have always chosen practical effectiveness over bureaucratic approval. Modern military analysts studying Vietnam-era special operations invariably note the Australian SAS's pragmatic approach to equipment. The modified M60 is cited as an example of how elite units operating under unique constraints develop unique solutions. It wasn't elegant. It wasn't sophisticated. But it worked. And in the jungles of Vietnam, where life expectancy could be measured in seconds once contact occurred, it worked was the only metric that mattered. 18 pounds of steel and desperation. A barrel cut short. A grip jury-rigged with tape and ingenuity. This was the weapon that turned foreman patrols into forces that could stand and fight against platoon-strength enemy units. This was the weapon that broke ambushes before they closed. This was the weapon that let Australian SAS soldiers fire from the hip and live to tell about it. The Viet Cong had the jungle. They had the numbers. They had home ground advantage. The Australian SAS had training, discipline, and soldiers who weren't afraid to take a hacksaw to a perfectly good machine gun if it meant coming home alive. In Phuoc Tuy province, from 1966 to 1971, that made all the difference. The modified M60, unofficial, unregulated, and utterly deadly, was the weapon the phantoms of the jungle carried when silence failed and violence was the only answer.